Hello, I'm Esther Gitu-Ewart. Welcome to Africa 54. Here's what's coming up. The 27 European Union member nations condemn Hamas for what they describe as the use of hospitals and civilians as human shields. The United Nations Refugee Agency and Sudanese doctors say fighters from a paramilitary force and their allied Arab militias have killed more than 800 people. And global cases of tuberculosis continued to rise last year as disruption to health services caused by the COVID-19 pandemic set back efforts to fight the disease. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. We begin our broadcast with the latest on the Israel-Hamas war. The 27 European Union member nations are jointly condemning Hamas for what they describe as the use of hospitals and civilians as human shields. European Union Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell says the EU has asked Israel for maximum restraint in its targeting in order to avoid casualties. Borrell commented as the EU foreign ministers gathered in Brussels Monday to discuss the situation in the Middle East and other hotspots.
We ask for an immediate pauses. I'm saying that in plural, not a single one, but several ones, pauses. But it is an adjective, it's immediate pauses and humanitarian corridors to be established in order to face the dire situation of the people in Gaza. So we condemn the use of Hamas as hospitals and people as human shields, and on the other hand we ask Israel for maximum restraint and targeting in order to avoid human casualties.
Israel says Hamas shields itself among civilians in hospitals and that Gaza's second largest hospital, Shifa Hospital, is a prime example of that. Israel claims that militant group has a command center in and beneath the medical compound, but it has not provided photos or videos to back up its claims, according to the Associated Press. Hundreds of Israeli demonstrators in Tel Aviv called on Sunday for the release of more than 200 hostages being held in Gaza. Several speakers took turns giving speeches on stage and soothing each other with songs, as many held posters of those held hostage by Hamas militants. Israel has revised its death toll, saying at least 1,200 people have died on the Israeli side, mostly civilians killed in the initial Hamas attack. Palestinian militants are holding nearly 240 hostages seized in the raid, including men, women, children, and older adults. The Israeli military says 44 soldiers have been killed in ground operations in Gaza. Meanwhile, a massive pro-Palestinian protest was held in London and elsewhere in Europe. Hundreds of pro-Palestinian protested peacefully in Germany's financial capital, Frankfurt, Sunday, demanding freedom for Palestine, while they accused Chancellor Olaf Scholz's government of siding with Israel and remaining silent about the victims in Gaza. Frankfurt police estimated the number of participants outside City Hall in Romberg Square at between 800 and 1,000 people. As he stressed that his country will continue its military operations in Gaza until it defeats Hamas, Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed speculation Sunday on a possible deal to free more than 200 hostages kidnapped by the militant group on October 7th. VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias has the details.
A day after dozens of Arab leaders held an emergency meeting in Saudi Arabia and strongly condemned the Israeli military offensive in Gaza, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan appeared on ABC, underlining the United States' position on Tel Aviv's war against Hamas.
We believe in the importance of the laws of war, which means taking every possible measure to protect civilians. At the same time, we will continue to stand behind the proposition that Israel has the right to defend itself against terrorist attacks.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was interviewed Sunday on CNN, was asked to comment on U.S. Secretary of State's Antony Blinken's recent remarks that too many Palestinians have been killed in Gaza.
I think any civilian loss is a tragedy, and the blame should be placed squarely on Hamas because it prevents them from leaving the war zone, sometimes at gunpoint. It fired on the safe zone and the safe corridor that we enacted.
Separately, Netanyahu addressed the speculation about a possible deal for the release of the hostages kidnapped by Hamas on October 7. His remarks aired on NBC's Meet the Press program.
Extraordinary work that the IDF is doing, putting pressure on the Hamas leadership. That's the one thing that might create a deal. And if a deal is available, well, we'll talk about it when it's there. We'll announce it if it's achieved.
The Prime Minister added that when the war is over, the overall military responsibility of Gaza will remain in the hands of Israel, but that it's too early to determine who will govern it.
As far as the civilian management of Gaza, we need to see the following two things. Gaza has to be demilitarized and Gaza has to be de-radicalized. And I think so far we haven't seen any Palestinian force, including the Palestinian Authority, that is able to do it.
Meanwhile, on the ground, Palestinian civilians continued fleeing northern Gaza, as several United Nations agencies called for an immediate halt on attacks against hospitals. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News, Washington.
For more on Israel-Hamas war, I'm joined live via Skype from Jerusalem by VOA correspondent Jan Bochat. Jan, what more can you tell us about today's activities?
Good evening, Esther. The battles are raging in Gaza City. The Israeli forces are getting closer and closer to the Shifa complex, a hospital. It's the biggest hospital in the Strip. Doctors inside the hospital say the situation is dramatic. It's terrible. They don't have power for the last 3 days. They say at least 200 bodies are starting to decompose inside the hospital. And now the patients in intensive care are dying. They say a lot of people are dying because they don't have oxygen, they don't have power. And the fighting, it's around the hospital. Nobody can leave there. They say at least 8,000 people are staying inside the complex, seeking for refugees, seeking for a safe place in there.
Well, so, to just echo what you're saying, we also just reported about EU diplomat Josep Borrell saying the EU has asked Israel for maximum restraint in its targeting in order to avoid casualties. What's the reaction so far from the government?
The Israeli government says that inside Shifa and underneath the Shifa hospital, Hamas has its main base, its control rooms, and all these depots. Those claims are not possible to be verified. At the same time, Hamas says they're not operating inside Shifa or around Shifa. Those claims also cannot be verified. The only thing we know is that the battles are going on around the hospital, and the situation seems to be very, very bad inside there.
Yeah, and demonstrators yesterday in Israel asked and, pounded on this issue of trying to get the hostages that were taken on October 7th freed. But do we know the status of these hostages? Do we know whether they are still alive, where they are being held? What is known about them?
There are a lot of rumors. Hamas says at least 50 of them were killed during Israeli bombardment of Gaza. But none of this information are solid, nothing concrete. Nobody knows exactly how many people, how many hostages are still alive. There are a lot of talkings between Qatar, Egypt, Israel, and U.S. trying to broke a deal to release those hostages. But so far, nothing concrete.
When you listen to Israelis there, some of the families, of course, know their families have been taken captive by Hamas. What do they say? Do they have hope that these children or their family members are still alive and they will be reunited at some point?
I think all of them, they still have hope. Time is passing and things are getting more and more difficult. There's a lot of pressure from the families for the Israeli government to try everything they can to bring the hostages back. They also asking the Israeli government, if needed, to stop the fighting, to try to find a deal with the Hamas to bring them back. But I would say the only thing that they still have is hope, but they don't have any information. They don't know what's going on, and there's a lot of sadness among them for this situation.
Jan, thank you very much. VOA correspondent Jan Bochat reporting live for us from Jerusalem. The African Union is calling for the release of Israeli hostages and protection of civilians in the Israeli-Hamas war, and it also faces pressure in some circles to make its position clear, as some AU members have done. Michael Walsh, a senior fellow in the Africa Program Foreign Policy Institute, talked about the situation.
So the African Union's in a really difficult position, as many international governmental organizations are. There's a split, or at least a perceived split, within the African Union membership on their position on Israel in this matter. However, if you look at the UN vote and you look at some of the things that have happened, there is a consensus across Africa, I think, that there should be a ceasefire. So when you look at the statements that have been made by the representatives of the African Union at the United Nations and other places, the focus of what has been called for here is the immediate ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities. And there's a focus, again, just like there was in Ukraine. I mean, you'll recall that South Africa played a big role on repatriating the children who were taken by Russia from Ukraine and other matters, and that became a major focus of their diplomatic engagement. Again, you see the African Union doing this similar thing, calling for the release of hostages and prisoners and trying to focus on civilians. And so the African Union hasn't taken the same position as the government of South Africa. It's obviously under pressure from some circles to do that, but it'd be very hard for the African Union as an organization to go as far as some of its members, because there isn't consensus within the African Union on this matter as well.
That was Michael Walsh, a senior fellow at the Africa Program Foreign Policy Institute. Pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian protesters clashed in Cape Town, South Africa Sunday, forcing local police to fire stun grenades and water cannon to quell the clashes. It's the first clashes to be reported in Africa since protests began in some African states following the Israeli-Hamas war. VOA's Ignatius Anor has been monitoring developments and joins me now for the latest reaction from the African public on the Middle East tensions. Hello, Ignatius. What more are we learning about this protest from the continent?
Thank you for having me. So as you rightly said in your intro, it is the very first clashes that have been reported since the war began in the Middle East. And just so you know, an organization known as the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, which is a religious group, on Sunday actually had called for people who stand with Israel to pray for the release of hostages that have been held in Gaza as we speak right now. And just in follow-up to that, there was also a pro-Palestinian protest that was ongoing, and they clashed, according to the French news agency Agence France Presse, which is AFP, that they clashed with this pro-Israeli protesters on Sunday, forcing local police to fire stun grenade and water cannons. As we speak now, there haven't been any casualties, and what happened yesterday perhaps could also be something that would happen, because again that institution has called for protest on Sunday, which is November the 19th. It is not clear as we speak what really led to that clash, but it also tells you about the sentiment that is around this particular situation on the continent.
Ignatius, which African countries have been vocal about this? What's really known, as far as you know, just been working on this story? What is currently the position of the African Union? Even though we heard from the analyst, what do we know about that, and what are Africans, talking about this, and what's their position?
So you know that it's been over a month since the conflict began. There have been several both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian protests that have been held. So you go to North Africa, there have been protests held in Rabat in Morocco, there have been protests held in Tunis in Tunisia, there have been protests held in Algiers in Algeria. You go to East Africa, we've also seen such protests happening in Kenya, for example. And just yesterday in Southern Africa, we also saw a pro-Palestinian protest happening in Harare in Zimbabwe, where the protesters were calling for a ceasefire. And as you know, since the war began, there have been protests that have been happening in South Africa, for example. And when you go to West Africa, we've also seen pro-Palestinian protests happening in Accra, in Ghana. In fact, just a few days after the attack by Hamas on October 7th, the Ghanaian president has actually came out to speak publicly, saying that the country was behind Israel solidly, as has South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, as has Kigali's Paul Kagame. So you're seeing these countries stand up, in support of Israel, and you're also hearing from the publics who are saying that we do not think what's happening against the Palestinians in particular is right. What is not too clear is what the position is as far as the attack on Hamas, which is the militant group, is concerned. On the AU front, since that war began, they called for ceasefire. As we speak now, yesterday I've spoken to a couple of analysts looking at what is going to happen as we saw South Africa and Chad withdraw, and they are saying that they foresee more African states following suit.
Ignatius, thank you very much. You've dug into this. Thank you for your reporting.
Thank you.
VOA correspondent Ignatius Anol with us here in the studio. The Sudan conflict that began in April between Sudan's army and rapid support forces has destabilized the western region of the country and reignited long-simmering feuds there. The European Union is condemning the escalation of violence in the Darfur region, where it warns of another genocide. Bodies of people in military uniforms littered the streets of Omdurman last week. The fighting is crippling the country's health infrastructure. Joseph Borrell, the EU's chief diplomat, said in a statement that more than 1,000 members of the Masalit community were killed in Ardamta, West Darfur, in just over 2 days during attacks by the RSF and affiliated militias. Borrell added that these latest atrocities were seemingly part of a wider ethnic cleansing campaign conducted by the RSF with the aim of eradicating the non-Arab Masalit community from West Darfur. Now, for more on the health impact of Sudan's continued fighting, I'm joined live from Boston, Massachusetts by Dr. Anmar Hameda, the Healthcare Programs Director with the Sudanese American Physicians Association. Dr. Hameda, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you so much, Esther, for inviting me.
Now, with the hospitals in Sudan, kind of down on their knees, how are they coping with the current situation, the killings and all of this stuff that we're seeing, bodies lying on the streets? What do you know, doctor?
Okay, thank you so much, Esther, for highlighting such an important aspect of what's going on right now in Sudan. The health system in Sudan, unfortunately, totally collapsed. More than 80% of the services that was actually located in Khartoum state are right now out of service. Even those are the remaining 20%, unfortunately, have been continuously harassed from the different artillery that have been unfortunately shot directly to those hospitals and healthcare workers. Including, by the way, the conflict that or the atrocity that you highlighted in Darfur, which has like some sort of genocide related and ethnic cleansing. Unfortunately, people were killing inside hospitals, bodies thrown out of the streets. There is no basic infrastructure that could secure safe water. That could secure, full availability for the people whom have been affected. Unfortunately, also, after more than 8 months of this conflict, we started to see post-traumatic stress disorders. People are started to realize that this unfortunate fighting between the two generals is not going to end soon. And unfortunately, they don't have the will, to cease fire and to look at their people.
Doctor, if you can briefly tell us what you are doing. I know in the past you've supported the only pediatric hospital remaining in Sudan. What kind of support is SAPA giving the doctors there, the medical facilities in terms of medicine, equipment? And as the weather pattern changes, what is the most important thing that needs to be done to prevent diseases from spreading?
Right now, SEPA is doing the best possible to mobilize resources from Sudanese doctors whom are able to support the people of Sudan, where we have like some sort of secured humanitarian corridors. So we are working right now in 6 safe states where it has like the huge amount of displaced, internally displaced people. We are trying the best possible to provide services that could support the availing quality health services for the people whom has been displaced, especially where we have like some sort of momentum for healthcare services, specifically in Jazeera State, Northern State, Red Sea State, and White Nile. We were working on the Darfur states, but unfortunately, due to the different nonsense attacks on civilians and hospitals, our services has been disrupted in South Darfur. And unfortunately, we lost, people who were directly contacted. We were having like some sort of support for them, especially, our healthcare workers lost their beloved ones in Nile, which has affected directly the service availability on those locations. So I really, I feel like I'm sort of ashamed of the situation of the healthcare services in Sudan because of the different disruption that health workers have faced.
Dr. Homeida, thank you very much. Dr. Anma Homeida is the Healthcare Programs Director with the Sudanese American Physicians Association. Still to come, global cases of tuberculosis continue to rise in 2022. We'll have the details shortly.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Moudou, in Washington every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
In other news, an address published on social media, former Ivory Coast Prime Minister Guillaume Soro, sentenced to life in prison in absentia in 2021 for undermining national security, says he is ending his self-imposed exile that began in 2019. Soro was previously the right-hand man to President Alassane Ouattara, who accused him of fomenting a civilian and military insurrection. Madagascar's outgoing president, Andry Rajoelina, says that he expects to be re-elected in presidential poll, but the run-up to the election has been marred by near-daily opposition demonstrations after disputes over its regularity. Rajoelina, 49, became Africa's youngest head of state in 2009 when he took power on the back of a coup. And Algerian President Abdelmadjid Tebboune has dismissed the country's prime minister and replaced him with the heads of his cabinet, according to the state news agency. The changing of the guard comes as the country is struggling with the inflation and ahead of next year's national elections. The global cases of tuberculosis continued to rise last year as disruption to health services caused by the COVID-19 pandemic set back efforts to fight the disease, according to the latest annual report from the World Health Organization. Henry Ridgwell reports.
Despite being treatable and curable, tuberculosis, or TB, remains one of the world's deadliest infectious diseases, causing an estimated 1.3 million deaths in 2022, according to the latest World Health Organization figures. That's a reduction of around 19% on the previous year. But there was a small increase in the number of cases to an estimated 10.6 million. Some 40% of people living with TB are undiagnosed and untreated. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, overwhelmed health services in many parts of the world, and TB diagnosis and treatment levels plummeted.
Unfortunately, the incidence through TB is growing. We used to have a decline of 2% per year. And then due to COVID, we have now an increase for the last 2 years, 21 and 22, of almost 4%.
The World Health Organization estimates COVID-related disruptions resulted in almost 500,000 excess deaths from TB in the 3 years from 2020 to 2022. The report also reveals a concerning lack of progress in some areas.
A pretty difficult situation on people with drug-resistant TB as well as childhood TB. So drug-resistant TB, short of 200,000 people were diagnosed and put in treatment, and exactly as WHO said, 2 out of 5 people with drug-resistant TB had access to drug-resistant TB treatment.
But the fight against TB is getting back on track. The number of cases diagnosed globally last year was 7.5 million, the highest ever recorded.
This shows that the countries buckled up to recover after COVID and even jump above the level before COVID.
A promising TB vaccine made by GlaxoSmithKline is currently in the final stage of trials, and more than a dozen other vaccines are undergoing testing.
We need a vaccine. So that will be the game changer. What it implies, I tell you what it implies. It implies to have either a vaccine that works perfectly on different age groups or several vaccines to complement each other.
The 19% fall in deaths from TB is still far short of the World Health Organization's target of a 75% reduction by 2025. Funding also fell short, reaching less than half of the WHO target of at least $13 billion for TB diagnosis, treatment and prevention services in 2022. Governments committed to spending $22 billion a year on TB by 2027 at a special UN meeting in September. Henry Ridgewell, VOA News, London.
Join us again tomorrow when the health correspondent Lino Mudu comes to the studio with more on health updates. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.